Now, it's absolutely crazy to me that everything you've ever touched, everything you've ever eaten in your whole life, everything you've ever breathed into your body, everything that you have ever come into contact with in your whole life, every single bit of it is actually made of atoms that you will never directly see. And inside those tiny atoms that you've never seen with your own eyes are electrons that you've never actually seen, or protons and neutrons that you've never actually seen. So here's the wild question for today. How do we actually know what's inside of an atom, what the inside looks like, or what's actually inside of something smaller than you've ever actually seen with your own eyes or directly observed? In other words, if we can't actually see individual atoms, how do we actually know what they're really made of? Now let's back up the truck about 2,500 years ago. There was a Greek philosopher named Democritus, and he asked a really simple question. And his question was, if you take a piece of paper and keep cutting it in half, and then taking that piece, cutting it in half, and take that piece and cut it in half, over and over and over again, can you actually do that forever? Well, the question sounds simple, but it's really not. So here we call this paper. We know it comes from trees. If I cut it in half, of course, pretend I cut it in half there, it's going to be half the size. I can cut it in half again, pretend that I cut this in half, and I have a smaller piece of paper. It still has the characteristics of paper. But what if I cut it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller so that it really is not even big enough for me to see anymore? But I have some magical microscopic scissors that can keep cutting it and cutting it and cutting it and just taking the pieces and cutting it smaller and smaller and smaller. Is there a point, this person asked, where it no longer becomes paper, but it becomes something more fundamental? That was his very insightful question. Now he argued no. Eventually you would reach something that could not be cut anymore. He called it atomos, Greek for uncuttable. He had zero equipment. He had no labs, no experiments, just pure logical thought. And he was basically right. For about 2,000 years, that idea, that important idea, mostly just sat there. Then, in 1803, an English chemist by the name of John Dalton brought atoms back, this time with evidence. Now, what he noticed is that these elements, they always seem to combine in fixed whole number ratios. We take that for granted today because you know water is H2O. But basically, he was investigating and figured out that water, which is everywhere, it's always 8 parts oxygen and 1 part hydrogen by weight. That's important, by weight. Always, it's never any different. And that regularity screamed that matter actually came in discrete countable chunks. Now you might say, wait a minute, 8 parts, 1 part, that doesn't make any sense. But remember, H2O, you know now, is 2 atoms of hydrogen, 1 atom of oxygen. But when you look on the periodic table, the hydrogen has very low mass. The oxygen, even though there's only 1 of them there, has much, much, much more mass. So if you don't really know and can't interact with the atoms and you're just separating it looking by weight, you can see that the ratio by weight is what Dalton basically revealed. Now, as humans, we try to build mental pictures of what it is we're investigating. Dalton actually pictured these atoms as tiny spheres, kind of like microscopic billiard balls. Now, that billiard ball model didn't last long. In 1897, which really was not that long ago, a physicist by the name of J.J. Thomson was actually experimenting with the old cathode ray tubes, basically the ancestors of the modern television, right? And he discovered something shocking. In these old cathode tubes, the old TV sets, they have an electron beam that's steered by a magnetic field and hits a screen and glows. And what he found is that matter contains these tiny negatively charged particles. They're much, much, much smaller than the atoms that we seem to see combining together to make everything, and he called them electrons. The atom, it seemed, was not solid after all. The atom had parts that were smaller. So now we know we have these small atoms everything is combining out of, and we know that atoms are made of smaller things. Now, Thomson proposed what's called the plum pudding model today, that electrons he thought were embedded or diffused in a blob of positive charge. These negative charge we're studying throughout, kind of like raisins in a pudding. That was his model. It sounds kind of strange today, but it was a serious scientific proposal based on real data of the time. Then came one of the most elegant experiments in all of history. In 1909, Ernest Rutherford actually fired positively charged particles, not negative, positively charged particles, he called them alpha particles, at an ultra-thin sheet of gold foil. So think of aluminum foil, but made out of gold. Most of those positive charges passed straight through. But some of them, about 1 in 8,000 of them that hit the foil, they didn't go through. They actually bounced off the foil and came straight back towards where they were being fired from. Now, Rutherford later said he imagined that this was almost like if he fired an artillery shell, a gigantic gun, right, at tissue paper, and actually had the shell bounce right back at him. Now, the only way any of this makes sense is if most of the mass of the atom is actually concentrated in a tiny, tiny central spot, really, really dense, positively charged core. Now, he called that the nucleus. It seemed like the atom was almost completely empty space. Now, let's think about this for a second. We have positive charges we're firing at this foil. Most of the time, the positive charges actually go right through the foil. That leads you to believe that most of the atoms that are in the foil are empty space. Otherwise, if it were not mostly empty space, it would bounce off. But most of the time, it goes through. But because it does bounce back very, very rarely, it implies that most of what we consider solid objects, the atom, is actually mostly empty space, and that the positive charge of the nucleus is got to be really, really small and surrounded by a lot of empty space, because when the positive projectile charge comes in, very rarely does it hit or interact with the positive nucleus charge, get repelled and bounce backward. So that was really weird. Not only is the atom made of smaller things, the negative charges of the electron and the positive charges in the nucleus, but the nucleus has to be really, really small and super concentrated with almost all of the mass in the nucleus. Now, fast forward a bit, in 1932, James Chadwick discovered what we call the neutron. It's a particle inside the nucleus that has mass but no charge. Now, the modern picture of an atom is more or less complete. A tiny, very, very dense nucleus where most of the mass is, that consists of protons, positively charged, and neutrons, which have no charge but have mass, surrounded by a cloud of these negative electrons with a vast empty space surrounding all of it. Now, you've probably actually seen images that look like colorful blobs arranged in patterns that say that we've imaged individual atoms. Are those actually real pictures? Well, not quite. They're not really real pictures in the way that you're thinking about it. And understanding why tells you something pretty profound. You see, in order for us to actually see something, to see anything around us, you need a wave, like light, for instance, that has a wavelength smaller than the object you're actually looking at, right? Visible light has a wavelength between 400 and 700 nanometers. So whenever light hits an object that's larger than that, it behaves like a bouncing particle, bounces off and the wave hits your eye, and then you can resolve the image of the apple or the car, which is much, much larger than the wavelength of any light you're using from the sun or a light bulb. But you see, atoms are much smaller, about 0.1 nanometers across. That's 4,000 times smaller than the wavelength of typical visible light. So if you use a microscope that uses light to look at an atom, it can't see them. It's kind of like trying to feel the texture of a coin, like a quarter or a nickel, through a thick winter glove. You just can't feel it because of the measurement process itself. It's not suited to pick up those fine details. Basically, when you're looking at something much, much, much smaller than the wavelength of light, like an atom, the incoming wave comes in, and you can think of it as a water wave enveloping, like if you're holding a pencil in the ocean, like a tiny pencil, and a gigantic water wave. I mean, the water wave will wash over it, but it's not going to bounce off the pencil. Because the pencil's so small, the wave will just envelop it and then kind of it'll interact, make some ripples or something, but it's not going to bounce off to a detector. So whenever light hits an atom, the similar thing happens. It might envelop it, it might interact with it, but it's certainly not going to reflect off of it so that you can resolve an image with your eyes. Now you might have heard of electron microscopes. We can use those to see much smaller things. You see, electrons are used instead of light because electrons have shorter wavelengths, smaller wavelengths than light, small enough to image large molecules, but individual atoms are still at the edge of what can be imaged by even the most powerful electron microscopes. Now you're saying, well, wait a minute. Electrons? What are you talking about, electron waves? Well, that's the thing that we learned, in the early part of quantum mechanics. We know that light has a wavelength. Photons are packets of energy that carry, light and have a wave-like property, and they have a wavelength, right? So we kind of think of light as wavy things. It took a long time, but we finally figured out that matter, all atoms, all electrons, all protons, all of it, actually have a wave-like character too. And it goes into how the momentum of the electron beam and some math involved, but basically electrons have a wave-like property too. And if you accelerate an electron beam in a vacuum chamber, like in a cathode ray tube or in an electron microscope, then that electron beam has a wavelength. And the more you accelerate it, you can make that wavelength smaller and smaller. And so basically, if you make the wavelength smaller and smaller, you can image and take pictures of smaller and smaller things. So that's why we use electron microscopes to see things smaller than regular microscopes that use visible light, because we can make the wavelength much, much, much smaller than the wavelength of light. Now, the real breakthrough with atoms and imaging came in 1981 with something called the scanning tunneling microscope, called an STM. The way this thing works is crazy, really. It takes an impossibly sharp metal tip, a physical metal tip, sometimes just 1 atom wide at the point of this tip, right? And it basically scrapes it along the surface of the object, kind of like those old record players. Now, when you take something so incredibly narrow and literally pull it across the surface, then electrons can actually quantum tunnel across the gap here, and the resulting electric current can be measured, and it can map the surface with atomic precision. So all of these images that you're seeing of individual atoms, they're actually reconstructed from data like this. They're not imaged in the same way that you think of, but by a physical measurement process involving one of these tips. So they're not really photographs per se, they're maps, sort of. Scraping maps, right? Kind of like an old record player, like I said. And in 1990, IBM scientists used a scanning tunneling microscope to actually spell out the letters IBM by moving, literally pushing around individual xenon atoms one by one and acquiring that image that you see by literally pulling that tip across. Now, I think that that is the exact moment when we stopped just detecting atoms and started manipulating them, because we could push them around. Now, by the 1960s, physicists suspected even protons and neutrons weren't fundamental. In other words, maybe they were constructed or made of smaller things. The protons and the neutrons were too large, too structured, so people thought they were made of something smaller. So there were physicists that proposed that neutrons and protons are each made of 3 smaller particles called quarks. Now, they didn't just make this up and say, oh, they're made of 3 quarks. I mean, there's a mathematical theory that was put forward that aligned with what we see in the laboratory. And actually, quarks were confirmed experimentally in the late 1960s at an accelerator called the Stanford Linear Particle Accelerator. Basically, scientists fired high-energy electrons at protons, smashing them in there, and watched them scatter off, and watched them with instruments is what I mean there. They weren't smooth. They acted as if they were hitting small point-like objects inside the protons. There were 3 smaller objects inside the protons and neutrons, just as predicted. 3 quarks to a proton. The catch? You can never actually isolate a single quark to look at one at a time. The weird thing about it is the force holding quarks together actually gets stronger the farther you pull it apart, which is totally opposite of gravity. This thing gets stronger the farther we pull it apart, kind of like a rubber band. If you pull it, it gets stronger and tries to pull you back, but this doesn't ever break. It just pulls harder and harder, pulling the quarks together. So no one has ever seen a quark by itself, and physics says that you never will. Now here, I hope I'm going to fry your brain, metaphorically. The modern picture of an atom isn't really particles like orbiting a nucleus like a solar system, like you might have been, seen a picture or taught in school, right? That image is just plain wrong. The weird thing about it is quantum mechanics tells us that electrons don't have definite positions at all. They don't behave like baseballs where they're there or there or there, where you can know where they are at any given time. They exist more as a wave. It's called a wave function, which is like a mathematical object or description that describes the probability of finding an electron somewhere, but only when you decide to measure it by interacting with it with some sort of experimental apparatus. So the electron around a hydrogen atom isn't a little ball just whizzing around like a solar system. It's kind of more like a fuzzy probability cloud smeared out in space with no definite position. And when you interact with it, which means you might look at it physically with, photons hitting it or whatever, or an instrument, the wave function is said to collapse to its current location at that time, governed by the probability cloud. But until then, it genuinely isn't anywhere specific. Tons and tons of experiments have confirmed this super weird behavior. Basically, we're all taught as kids that it's like a little solar system going around with the electrons. Basically, it's not correct. We know it's not correct based on modern quantum theory. You have to start somewhere. It's a good mental picture. But basically, electrons are not little balls where you can say they're here or here. When you're not interacting with them, they exist as a smeared out probability density. You can almost say that they're everywhere at once. I know that sounds crazy, but they only really collapse to a given position when we interact with them. And in between interactions, the best description is this smeared out wave function probability. And it even goes deeper than this, believe it or not. Quantum field theory, which is our best current framework of all of this stuff, says that electrons and quarks aren't even particles in the traditional sense. They're not even particles. Think about it. They're excitations or vibrations in what's called a quantum field that permeates all of space. You can think of these quantum fields being everywhere, like a magnetic field or an electric field is everywhere. So an electron, we think of as a particle, is really a localized ripple in the electron field that's everywhere. The way a wave on the ocean isn't really a separate object, it's a disturbance in the water. That's what we call a wave in the ocean. The entire universe at its foundation is really a collection of these overlapping quantum fields, and what we actually call matter that we can hold in our hand is just energy concentrated in those particular fields in a certain way. They're excitations in these quantum fields. The evidence for this crazy sounding theory is actually incredible. The electron's magnetic moment, which is calculated using quantum electrodynamics, it actually matches experimental values to 12 decimal places. Decimal point with 12 digits after. That's how close this theory, quantum field theory, matches reality. That's the most accurate prediction in the history of science. So, to sum it all up, we've never actually seen an atom with our own eyes. I certainly haven't, you certainly haven't, and we never will. They're just too small. But we have mapped them. We have moved them around and influenced how they behave and where they exist relative to each other. We've split them in half to release energy. We've decoded the quantum fields that they're made of with breathtaking precision. So the next time you brew a cup of coffee and you pick it up and drink some of your coffee and you remember that it's actually made of these amazing things called atoms with all of their incredible structure going down and down and down, smaller and smaller, always remember to stay curious. Learn anything at mathandscience.com.